I lived a quiet, measured life for the first 5 years of my marriage. We had no children yet, we rented a cozy little house, and my husband Timothy spent most of his time trying to grow a small business he'd founded a couple of years before our wedding. I liked our modest routines. I felt safe knowing exactly when my paycheck arrived and exactly how much went into my savings. Trust was so fundamental to my idea of marriage that I never thought to question if everything he told me matched reality. Even so, little details in the months leading up to my crisis began to gnaw at me. A credit card bill that seemed higher than normal, he insisted it was just some business purchases he'd reimburse, phone calls from unknown numbers that he'd answer in hushed tones, and bank statements that never quite added up. I told myself marriage meant believing your partner. I told myself that if there was a problem, Timothy would speak up. I was wrong. Everything changed on a Tuesday. I'd been sifting through a stack of mail, tossing supermarket flyers and coupon packets aside, when a plain white envelope caught my eye. It bore an unfamiliar bank's logo, addressed to me personally. I almost dropped it in the spam pile, but an odd feeling made me open it. My heart thudded the moment I saw the words, "We are pleased to inform you that your loan application has been approved." I didn't recall any loan application, certainly not with that bank. The letter included details about my requested amount, references to an outstanding balance, and a schedule for automatic deductions from my account. That was enough to make me step back, confusion flickering into dread. The letter was definitely in my name, same exact spelling and contact information I used on official documents. Timothy arrived home from a short errand as I stood in the living room, letter in one hand, the rest of the unopened mail in the other. He glanced at my expression, then at the page trembling between my fingers. Instead of curiosity, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew. I asked him directly, "Did you do this?" He took a moment too long to respond, leaving a silence that screamed guilt. Then, in a burst of nervous energy, he admitted his business had needed cash to stay afloat. He'd used my name, my strong credit, to secure a short-term loan. His voice rose and fell in a plea for understanding. I felt the color draining from my face. I knew if he'd told me up front, I might have at least listened to why he was desperate. But forging my consent to open a loan behind my back was a betrayal I couldn't process all at once. I dropped the rest of the mail on the coffee table, walked into the kitchen, and stood there gripping the counter, my breath coming in uneven jolts. He hovered in the doorway, insisting I'd never bear any burden. He planned to repay it quickly. He tried to sound confident, as if everything was under control. Still, every piece of me screamed that this was no small slip. My father used to warn me never to let anyone play with my credit or sign anything without reading the fine print. All I could think about was his worried face from decades ago, when a mountain of unexpected debt nearly cost us our home. The memory made my skin prickle with fear, then flush with anger. The rest of that evening was thick with tension. I tried to push him for details. How big was the loan? How long had he been planning this? He mumbled that it was a temporary fix. He never once gave me exact numbers. I wanted to press him harder, but part of me was so stunned I couldn't marshal the right words. After he went to bed, I stayed up late, rereading that letter until the words blurred together. From that moment, an invisible rift cracked our marriage's foundation. Even as we fell into bed, neither of us slept well. I could hear him tossing and turning on his side, while I stared at the ceiling, unable to quell the anxiety curdling in my stomach. The next day, I couldn't let it go. I tried to reach the bank's hotline during my lunch break, determined to figure out how they granted a loan with my signature that I had never actually given. The wait times were endless, and I kept glancing around to make sure my co-workers didn't overhear. After about 15 minutes on hold, a polite-sounding woman informed me that if I believed fraud had taken place, I should fill out a formal affidavit, attach relevant documents, and submit them. When I pressed for details, she repeated scripted phrases about internal investigations. She didn't shrug me off exactly, but her professional tone was a reminder that proving fraud wasn't a simple matter of "I didn't sign that." The process would demand evidence, identity checks, possibly a police report. I hung up with no real sense of relief, but at least I had a first step. After work, I confronted Timothy again. I told him I'd be filing a fraud claim if he didn't disclose the entire truth. His posture shifted from anxious to defensive. He insisted he'd pay everything back within weeks, that I shouldn't blow this into a legal scandal. He sounded agitated, as though I was betraying him by not letting him fix it alone. That's when I noticed a second envelope among the day's mail, a different bank's logo, also addressed to me. My stomach lurched. I was almost afraid to open it, but I did, scanning the paragraphs until I found a phrase about recently approved line of credit. My gaze snapped up to Timothy, who looked momentarily cornered, then began stumbling through half apologies. Multiple loans. I sank onto the sofa, trying to calm my racing heart. My trust in him was eroding at an alarming speed. But I also realized something else. He must have been forging my name for months. Lines of credit, short-term high-interest deals, all riding on my clean credit history. I demanded specifics, but he only stammered, "I had no choice." A wave of anger hit me. Instead of letting it fester, I stormed into our makeshift home office and started rummaging through the filing cabinet, scanning for documents with my name. My hands shook, but I tried to focus on each paper I found: old tax returns, insurance forms, credit card statements. Tucked at the bottom, I found a typed agreement from a credit union I'd never used, bearing my forged signature. The loop on the J in my name was eerily close, but not perfect. I let out a harsh breath, feeling both fury and a grim sense of betrayal. Timothy hovered in the doorway, urging me to just let him handle it. He promised he only needed another month or two. At that moment, I remembered how often I'd noticed he'd been taking calls in hushed whispers, or how he'd jumped to close his laptop whenever I walked in. All those oddities made terrifying sense now. I told him I'd get a lawyer if that's what it took. He clutched my arm, face taut, warning me about the mess that could unfold. But I pulled free and walked out. I wasn't sure if I was more furious or heartbroken, but I knew I couldn't just sit and wait. My first meeting with an attorney felt surreal. The stale coffee in the waiting area was the least of my worries. I'd brought the suspicious letters, copies of my ID, and even pictures I'd taken of the forged loan documents. The lawyer, a calm woman with sharp eyes, listened intently. She didn't look shocked, she'd probably seen it all before. That alone made me feel slightly better. If it was a common scenario, maybe there was a straightforward path to fix it. She clarified there was no guarantee of a quick solution. "If your husband forged your signature, that's potentially criminal," she said, flipping through the documents. "You might have to file a police report if the banks won't remove your liability. Otherwise, they can come after you for repayment, because on paper, it's your debt." I left her office with a sheaf of papers outlining potential next steps, including how to file a fraud claim, send dispute letters to each bank, and gather more proof. The dryness of the legal language frustrated me. This wasn't just a case number, it was my life. But I realized bureaucracy would be my only lifeline if Timothy refused to come clean and fix things. When I got home, he was pacing around the living room, phone in one hand, a cluster of bills in the other. The minute I mentioned the lawyer, his face contorted. He insisted that if I took the nuclear option, I'd undermine his chance to salvage the business. He was angry that I couldn't just trust him to pay everything off. And that's when something else caught my eye. On the coffee table lay a single sheet of paper I didn't recognize. It looked like a notarized form with my name and signature at the bottom, though I never remembered signing anything of the sort. Timothy snatched it up before I could read more. I demanded to see it, he insisted it was just an old insurance document. But the way he shielded it told me otherwise. My stomach twisted with unease. I realized, with dawning horror, he might be preparing more forged papers. That suspicion lodged itself in my mind, amplifying my paranoia. Was he planning to implicate me if everything went south? Or was he forging more signatures to obtain yet another loan? The possibilities made my skin crawl. For the first time, a tiny voice in my head whispered, "He's not just cornered, he might try to blame you." Tension thickened in the days that followed. I tried to gather every piece of financial evidence I could find, emailing copies to my lawyer. Timothy avoided me whenever I mentioned I was building a paper trail. Sometimes, I'd overhear him taking phone calls in a frantic tone, dropping hints like, "I'll get it soon," or "No, she doesn't know I'm calling." Every time I tried to confront him, he'd brush me off or storm out, claiming he was too stressed to argue. Meanwhile, the banks began sending me notices. One demanded the first installment on a personal loan, due in 2 weeks. Another threatened to cancel a line of credit if immediate payment wasn't made. I called them, only to be shuffled from one department to another. At best, I'd reach a risk management agent who repeated that any claim of forgery required official affidavits, supporting documents, possible third-party handwriting analysis. Everything took time. And time was the one thing we didn't have, as interest piled up daily. I felt my patience snapping. Instead of just trembling or wringing my hands, I found myself taking more decisive actions. I started drafting the fraud affidavits, collecting every sample of my real signature I could think of, driver's license, old job applications, even scribbled grocery lists, to contrast with the neat, suspiciously perfect versions on the loan paperwork. Each day, I scanned them into my computer late at night. During one of these nights, the phone rang around 11. A blocked number. Usually, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. A man's voice asked if this was Timothy's number. I said no, but that I was his wife. The man hesitated, then said he was representing a lending group, and he was trying to confirm certain details. I inquired what details. He immediately backtracked, explaining he couldn't discuss confidential business matters with me. That call left a bitter taste in my mouth. It wasn't just overdue bills, someone was sniffing around, checking references, possibly verifying Timothy's claims. The next morning, I found Timothy at the kitchen table, scribbling numbers into a small notebook. He looked exhausted. But when I asked about the call, he grew defensive, flipping the notebook shut. "I'm handling it," he muttered. My gaze hardened. "And what if you're handling it by throwing me under the bus?" He gave me a look, a flash of something like guilt, before pushing past me to get out the door. Around that time, I started getting demands from a new lender I had zero recollection of. A thick envelope arrived, stuffed with formal notifications about a past due account. The principal was much higher than the earlier loans, the interest rate downright predatory. My name was all over the contract. I sat down at my desk, scanning each paragraph, sick to my stomach. Whoever forged that document had gone to extraordinary lengths. A signature line for me, a signature line for Timothy, a notary stamp. It looked legitimate in every way. When I confronted him that evening, he seemed trapped in his own panic. "I didn't want to drag you in," he said, voice wavering. "I just needed more capital for one final push." I had no choice. It was already done. I realized, with a terrifying clarity, that we might be dealing with tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Sums that could bankrupt me if the banks pinned it on me. My credit rating, which I'd guarded my entire adult life, was being shredded. Bills were piling up. Timothy's business must have been failing far more catastrophically than I ever knew. Late that night, I found myself hunched over my laptop, emailing a detective in the local fraud division. My attorney had given me his contact info earlier, explaining that sometimes local law enforcement can at least document a report. Even if they might not swoop in to arrest someone for forging a spouse's signature, an official record might lend weight to my dispute claims. My heart hammered as I typed out the situation, the forged documents, the suspicious loans, and the deep fear that Timothy might blame me to cover himself. Pressing send felt like crossing a line of no return. Timothy still tried to reassure me that he'd repay everything within a month or two. But each time he tried to lay out the math, some vague plan of funneling sales revenue to cover interest, I saw no logic or guarantee. I asked him point blank if he'd been making false statements in his loan applications about his revenue. His silence gave me all the answer I needed. In bed that night, we lay side by side, but it felt like we were miles apart. The next morning started with a phone call from the detective. He wanted me to come in and provide a statement. I texted Timothy about it, he didn't reply. My attorney accompanied me to the station, where I described the forged forms. I handed over copies I'd printed, highlighting the obvious differences in my signature's details. The detective took notes, asked about my relationship with Timothy, and then asked if I had any reason to believe he might claim my full complicity. A chill settled in me. He hinted at needing my cooperation, I admitted. But I'm not sure if he's actively forging more, or planning to tell authorities I signed everything willingly. The detective nodded. If we see that he's forging a continuous paper trail to pin these actions on you, that's fraud on top of fraud. It was sobering to hear it spelled out like that. For the first time, I realized how big this could get. It wasn't just a matter of a few loans. If Timothy had lied to multiple financial institutions, the fallout could involve federal agencies, too. Days passed, and each one brought new complications. My attorney kept filing notices of dispute with the banks, insisting the debts were fraudulent. Some lenders responded with requests for more documentation. Others threatened to send debt collectors if I didn't make a payment. I felt stuck in a swamp of red tape, shutting down one threat only to see another pop up. And in those tense days, Timothy's behavior grew more erratic. Sometimes, he'd vanish for hours, returning with no explanation. Other times, he'd be at home, hunched over his laptop, frantically typing. I noticed he'd set his phone to silent, ignoring calls he once would have taken. A part of me suspected his business partners or creditors were hounding him, and he had no answers left. One night, near midnight, I heard him on the phone. I crept to the hallway, heart pounding, as he said in a strained whisper, "Look, if the numbers don't match, that's her fault. She's the one who managed the paperwork." My blood ran cold. He was laying groundwork to blame me. I backed away before he saw me, but the betrayal seared. I tried to focus on building a bulletproof case for my innocence. My attorney suggested I pay for a handwriting expert to analyze the forged documents. The cost was steep, but worth it if it helped absolve me of liability. The expert's preliminary findings confirmed numerous discrepancies. Certain flourish marks were inconsistent with my known handwriting. Meanwhile, Timothy's own writing samples from old forms matched the style of these suspicious signatures more closely than he realized. Though that gave me a sense of validation, it didn't stop the lenders from pursuing payment. One particularly aggressive collection agency served me with a lawsuit at work, humiliating me in front of colleagues. The legal complaint basically stated that I had defaulted on a large personal loan, so they were seeking the full amount plus fees. My attorney assured me we could countersue or file for a dismissal if we proved forgery, but that would require court time, money, and many months of hearings. Timothy's desperation shot through the roof. He started lashing out at me for digging us into a deeper hole, as though my attempts to prove the truth were some kind of sabotage. More than once, he insisted if I'd just pretend the debt was valid for a while, lenders might ease up. That idea was so absurd I could barely respond. Did he genuinely believe I'd put my entire future on the line for the sake of his failing enterprise? We had no normal home life anymore. He slept in the guest room, or sometimes not at all. The tension was visible in the clutter piling up, half-finished cups of coffee, scattered envelopes, a stack of financial statements that felt like a ticking bomb. Whenever I tried to organize them, Timothy would get jumpy, telling me to leave his papers alone. But I refused to be shut out. I was determined to keep pushing. And push I did. I filed a police report, emailed the detective updates whenever a new letter or contract surfaced, and forwarded every shady document to my lawyer. It felt like I was building a fortress of evidence around myself, but it also felt like I was erecting an unscalable wall between me and the man I once loved. A few weeks later, I got called to a meeting by one of the banks, a major lender with which I supposedly had taken out a substantial sum. My attorney came with me. We were ushered into a small, windowless conference room, where two bank representatives sat with stern expressions. They wanted me to walk them through the timeline, when I discovered the loans, why I was disputing them, how the signatures got forged. I spoke calmly, even though my pulse hammered. They flipped through the documents I'd provided, noting the discrepancies. One of them asked, "Do you have any proof that your husband was behind this? It might be a different identity thief." The question stung, but it made sense from their perspective. I explained that I'd found suspicious forms in our home, that he'd admitted to forging documents, though not in writing. The conversation then veered into an unexpected direction. They claimed Timothy had submitted additional paperwork, stating that I was fully aware of the loans and had used the funds myself. My stomach twisted. This was exactly what I'd feared. He was actively trying to paint me as a willing participant. One of the representatives placed a copy of some new contract on the table, pointing at the signature line. The forging was more sophisticated this time, matching my signature so closely I had to stare hard to see the slight differences in the letter spacing. My attorney argued that my documented signature samples from the handwriting expert cast serious doubt on the authenticity of these new forms. The bank representatives promised they'd investigate, but the undercurrent of suspicion was clear. If Timothy's statements contradicted mine, they might side with him unless I could produce a mountain of evidence. Walking out of that building, I felt physically and mentally drained. My attorney squeezed my shoulder in a reassuring gesture. "We'll fight this," she said. "But prepare yourself, it won't be quick." I pressed my lips together, forcing back tears. I realized how dangerously far Timothy was willing to go to save his own skin, even if it meant burying me in the process. Soon after, a swirl of rumors emerged that federal investigators were sniffing around Timothy's business, suspecting larger-scale fraud. Supposedly, he'd falsified revenue reports to lure in private investors, and the deception might involve interstate funding, which drew federal attention. I picked up bits and pieces of this from acquaintances, nervous employees at his small firm who called me anonymously, or half-coherent messages left on my voicemail. I tried to talk to Timothy about it, but he alternated between angry denials and frenzied pleas for me to keep quiet. Then one afternoon, two men in formal attire knocked on the front door. My heart stuttered when I saw they were indeed federal agents. I had to let them in. They wanted to ask about certain irregularities related to Timothy's financial dealings. He was out at the time. They questioned me politely but firmly, wanting to know if I'd helped him secure loans under false pretenses. I explained how it was exactly the opposite, that I was the victim here, showing them my dispute letters. At first, they looked skeptical, but once I handed them copies of the forged contracts, their tone shifted. They asked if Timothy had ever hinted at forging more signatures, or if he'd tried to coerce me into playing along. I admitted I'd heard phone calls suggesting as much. Their gaze sharpened. One of them quietly noted that if Timothy had roped me in or tried to shift blame, it might be part of a broader pattern. They took a few notes, asked me to remain available for further questions, and left. My nerves buzzed in the aftermath. There was a hollow sense of relief. They believed me somewhat, but also the dread that my husband might face a real criminal charge. That night, I sat in the dark living room, trying to figure out what I was fighting for anymore. To clear my name, obviously, but beyond that, was there any marriage left to save? When Timothy finally came home hours later, I confronted him about the agents. He looked stricken, then furious. His voice broke as he accused me of handing everything over. "You think they'll just let you off the hook? If I go down, you go down," he shouted. I turned away, chest tight, tears threatening to surface. This wasn't a momentary mistake. He was choosing this path, doubling down on deceit. The pity I'd once felt for his desperation was vanishing, replaced by a cold resolve to protect myself at all costs. As the legal battles intensified, I realized just how many steps were involved in clearing my name. Each lender demanded separate affidavits and potential in-person statements. Some insisted on a handwriting exam from their own expert. My attorney prepared a massive file for each case, meticulously documenting every discrepancy. She emphasized we had to keep pressing because any gap or delay could give the banks reason to think I was complicit. Meanwhile, my credit score had plummeted. Collection agencies started calling me at work, leaving automated voicemails about urgent debt matters. It was a nightmare. My boss, noticing my distress, pulled me aside. He asked if everything was okay. I mumbled something about an identity theft situation. He was sympathetic, but I could tell my situation made him uneasy. If it got worse, like wage garnishments or lawsuits, my job could be at risk. Adding to the chaos, Timothy's business officially collapsed. I heard he had to lay off employees, shutter the office. The time he used to spend there, he now spent scouring the internet for quick cash solutions or meeting with lawyers. I occasionally glimpsed statements on the kitchen counter referencing bankruptcy, bridging loans, or settlement offers. Even though I felt a stab of sympathy for him, as a fellow human, I couldn't let it overshadow the fact he was actively trying to pin blame on me. The last straw came when I received a letter from the county court, stating a hearing date for one of the lawsuits a lender had filed against me personally. My attorney had filed a countersuit, but they were doubling down. If the judge ruled against me, I'd be on the hook for a massive sum. Anxiety gnawed at me every time I tried to sleep. In the mornings, I'd force myself out of bed, determined not to let fear paralyze me. Each day felt like a test of endurance. On a Saturday, as I was sorting through yet another stack of legal documents, Timothy burst in, looking disheveled and frantic. He said something about final notices, that everything was about to come crashing down unless we united to pay off the lenders. I stared at him in disbelief. "Unite?" I repeated. "You forged my name. You blame me to the bank representatives, you threatened to drag me under if you're charged, and now you want me to join you in repaying debts I never signed up for." He had no answer. He just sank into a chair, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. For a moment, I almost reached out to comfort him, but then I remembered the phone calls, the new forged documents, the unstoppable tide of debt. I left him there and retreated to my room. When the court hearing finally arrived, the tension was overwhelming. My lawyer and I walked into a small courtroom where a lender's attorney was already seated, rifling through thick folders. Timothy showed up with his own counsel, someone I recognized as a local litigator known for representing businesses in financial trouble. We sat at opposite sides, exchanging no words. The proceedings were slow, methodical. The judge asked questions about the dispute, the evidence of forgery, and my personal involvement. My attorney presented the handwriting expert's report, plus the chain of emails showing my repeated attempts to dispute the debt from day one. The lender's attorney argued that because I was married to Timothy, I must have benefited from the loans. They claimed the money went toward shared living expenses. The tension spiked when Timothy's lawyer rose, presenting a freshly notarized document. I glanced at it, stunned. It purported to show I'd personally granted Timothy power of attorney to handle financial matters on my behalf. My jaw clenched. That was a blatant lie. I'd never signed such a thing. Yet the signature was an uncanny match for mine. Only a tiny misalignment in the last letter gave it away. The judge frowned, clearly unsure whom to believe. My attorney requested a brief recess to review this so-called power of attorney. We regrouped, scanning the document. I felt my pulse race as I pointed out small discrepancies in the handwriting. She nodded, ready to challenge it. Back in the courtroom, she calmly laid out each reason why the document was fraudulent, referencing the forensic analysis we'd already provided. Then, in a striking moment, she passed copies of old documents I'd signed, side by side with Timothy's known handwriting. It was as if a mask slipped off, revealing the forger's identity. The lender's attorney looked unsettled. They weren't expecting such a thorough takedown. The judge ordered an additional hearing to examine the signature question in more detail, but he made it clear that if the power of attorney was indeed forged, I could not be held liable for the debt. That single statement felt like a fractured kind of hope. Yet, it also meant more delays, more legal fees, more waiting. When the session ended, Timothy wouldn't meet my eyes. He quickly conferred with his lawyer and left. I watched him go, a wave of conflicting emotions twisting inside me. Every new piece of evidence that cleared my name was a nail in the coffin of our marriage. If we had any chance of reconciliation, it had been obliterated by that forged power of attorney. In the weeks that followed, my attorney pressed for depositions and further discovery. The closer we got to exposing Timothy's forging methods, the more frantic he seemed. I discovered some new phone logs on a shared tablet. He'd been calling lenders daily, trying to negotiate behind my back. There were also panicked emails between him and his now former business partner, referencing something about cutting losses and blaming the wife's finances. My heart hardened reading them. Eventually, after multiple depositions, the forensic evidence became overwhelming. Not only were the signatures on the loans proven to be forgeries, but it also became apparent Timothy had faked entire sets of documents for personal gain. Even the banks couldn't ignore the mounting proof that I'd been duped. One by one, they began dropping their claims against me, removing my name from the liabilities. It wasn't instant or easy. Each case took additional follow-up, phone calls, emails, and in some instances, small court hearings. But the tide was turning. The final blow came when federal investigators formally charged Timothy with fraud, citing evidence that went beyond just the forged loans in my name. He had scammed private investors, doctored financial statements, and possibly laundered funds. I received a request to testify, and my attorney advised me to comply fully. Standing in a federal building, giving my account under oath, felt surreal. I spoke about discovering the forgery, the repeated lies, and the manufactured power of attorney. The prosecuting attorney seemed satisfied that I was another victim in his elaborate scheme. By then, Timothy and I had separated physically. He left the house, and I changed the locks to protect myself. I filed for divorce shortly after, with no remorse. The moment I came home from the final hearing where the judge dismissed the last of the lender's claims against me, I dropped onto the couch, exhaled a trembling breath, and stared at the ceiling for a long, silent minute. It was over. At least, the main financial war was over. But not everything snapped back to normal. My credit took a beating that would take time to repair. The emotional scars of betrayal still ran deep. The entire ordeal had lasted months, costing me countless hours and legal fees. And yet, as I sat there, I felt a small spark of relief. I'd fought back. I'd refused to be a silent victim. Occasionally, I still get mail about ongoing proceedings in Timothy's case, or letters from banks acknowledging the resolution of my disputes. I keep them all neatly filed, both as evidence and as a reminder of what I endured. Friends ask if I'll ever forgive him. I can't answer that yet. I don't wish him physical harm, but what he did, deceiving me, forging my name, trying to cast blame, are choices that have lasting consequences. I share this story as a caution. Sometimes the biggest betrayal comes from the person you trust most. And when that trust cracks, it's not just your heart at risk, it's your livelihood, your credit, your entire future. If you find yourself in a similar nightmare, document everything, speak up immediately, and brace for a tough fight. Because although justice can prevail, it rarely does so quickly, and never without a cost. I'm rebuilding now. I rent a small apartment and handle every piece of mail with newfound vigilance. I no longer glance over bank statements, I dissect them line by line. My lawyer remains on speed dial. My heart is heavier, but my resolve is stronger. Maybe that's the silver lining in all this. Once you've survived the threat of financial ruin, you learn what you're truly capable of. I'll never forget the day that plain white envelope arrived, the one that shattered my illusions about marriage and trust. Yet in the end, confronting that betrayal taught me that my identity is more than a signature on a page, and no one, not even the person once closest to me, can take that away forever.